Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Horror of Dracula from 1958. And today is day 3 of my Halloween week of videos. Horror of Dracula, or Dracula as it's called in England, is probably one of the most famous and well-regarded Hammer horror films ever. It wasn't actually the first Hammer horror film. That one goes to The Curse of Frankenstein, or Frankenstein as it was in England. Most of these titles had to be changed in America because there's already a movie called Dracula and Frankenstein. Although I find that to be an odd little distinction to always say America, because didn't those movies exist in England too? Like, they're pretty big movies, so it also makes sense as to not confuse them. I just never understood why they always go, well, in America, because the studio made them change them, but it's also like it gets confusing when you want to Google search these things. You often have to search the American title to distinctly find them, otherwise like there's a million movies called Dracula. It's very confusing. But anyway, this is also, even though it is Christopher Lee's second time being the monster, his more famous Hammer horror role. Even if you look on his Wikipedia after he died, many clips and most of it we're talking about this film. And it's not like Lugosi's 31 Dracula or Todd Browning's 31 Dracula. It is a lot more British, obviously, but I think what this film has, even though you can tell they're just using the same sets for cost effectiveness, and sometimes it can be a little slower, when it really strikes you, it strikes you hard. It strikes you kind of like a steak, to be honest. And when Christopher Lee's on screen as Dracula, this tall, very English, very mysterious guy lurking in the shadows, it's a sight to behold in itself. He's definitely someone who's going to jump out at you, and you can tell how he became a star out of this. It's such a star-making role. It's probably one of the greatest star-making horror film turns in all of cinema history. He is incredible in this role, and he definitely puts his own spin on it. I think a lot of people, when they think of Dracula, they think of Lugosi. And Christopher Lee, it's like he's not even really thinking about it. Certainly the way you hold the cape owes a lot to how Lugosi did it, but Christopher Lee totally reinvents the role in a way, which shows you how good of an actor he was and why people had such great respect for him. Jonathan Harker, who in May 1885 travels to the castle of Count Dracula near Kalsenberg to take post as his librarian for a library I don't really think we see that much of, but he's there to do it. And he goes to the house and no one's there to greet him, and he starts eating, and this girl tells him she wants to be rescued, and then she runs off after he tries to stake the young girl, because he's actually not there to be a librarian, he's there to finally take out the evil Dracula. He is then bitten by one of the vampire girls and Dracula himself and turned into a vampire, and then Dr. Van Helsing, played by the great Peter Cushing, goes to try to track him down and find out what happens, and finds that Dracula is trying to turn Jonathan Harker's fiance. Van Helsing kills Jonathan Harker, but Dracula very much wants to turn his fiance into his bride because Jonathan Harker killed Dracula's own bride, and he's trying to go after her. And Peter Cushing as Van Helsing is trying to stop Dracula and put a stake through his heart. One of the things about Hammer horror films is you really have to understand when these films happen. In the late 50s, Universal horror films were still being re-released. They were about to be played on TV incessantly, but they were pretty much over. Most of the Universal horror films that happened in the 30s, and this was the late 50s, and times had actually very much changed from the early 30s to the late 50s. There'd been like this whole war thing and a lot of other stuff, and so people clearly needed their monster movies, I guess, rebooted for their own generation. See, it's not just the crazy millennials who need things rebooted. Every generation likes their spin on those classic stories, and Hammer came along at a time when Universal really wasn't doing that. Even though Frankenstein, their first film, the book was in the public domain, so they could do that. There wasn't many studios that could fight them on that one. But with this film, Universal and Hammer had to work out an agreement. The agreement wasn't completed until after they filmed this movie, which must have been a little scary, and it ended in an 80-page legal document, which sounds like a lot of fun. It came along at a time when those kind of monsters needed to be revamped, what you consider the classic Universal monsters. Hammer did a lot of different spins on those, some not so successfully, but I think the most successful was this one. I don't know the book Bram Stoker's Dracula that well, but this doesn't feel like the book or like the film Lugosi was in. This feels like its own thing. It feels very British. It feels like a slower kind of mystery in a lot of ways, especially the way Peter Cushing plays it. The interplay between having these incredibly strong personalities between Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee in this film really makes it very palpable. Even though it can be very dry and British a lot of the time, this film very much is, it still can be very audience friendly, and not just for a particular way of telling a story. It can jump out at you, it can surprise you, it can do all these things to you that you didn't think a story like this could really do while you're watching it. In some parts you might think some of it's a tad boring, but when it really jumps out at you and that music plays, like any classic monster has their own theme, and Christopher Lee's Dracula has a great theme. When that pops on, you know you're going to be surprised. A lot of this film, the people are kind of walking around blinded by Dracula, a lot of the women, and it's almost like Peter Cushing is the only one that can see, and his character Van Helsing is really driving the film, and Peter Cushing's so good at that. If you don't think you know Peter Cushing, if you've seen Star Wars, you know who Peter Cushing is. In the original first Star Wars, he is the bad guy who is not Darth Vader, and anyway, you should know who Peter Cushing is. He's a great actor, but he kind of just plays the heavy in this film. He's almost playing in a way that you could tell that character doesn't care if you like him, but you almost kind of like him more because he's the only one who really knows what's going on, and he drives the plot in such a way. But he plays it so magnificently, and his face when he's determined, you kind of just want to see how he's going to solve it. You know he's smart enough to do it, you just want to see him do it. Peter Cushing's probably my favorite portrayal of Van Helsing I've ever seen, because he just knows how to do that. He just has that determination in him. It's kind of that determination you like to follow, and it plays so well off of Christopher Lee's creepy, romantic, dark side. I like how tall he is. I've never seen a Dracula or a vampire as tall as Christopher Lee. It's quite amazing. And Michael Gough, who most of us probably know as being Alfred in the Tim Burton's Batman and all of those films. I'm assuming actually Tim Burton probably casted him because of the Hammer horror films, because he did do that with Christopher Lee, so I wouldn't say it's too off that he did that. He's very good as well, and it took me a while to place him. I'm like, where do I know him? And I was like, oh my god. I figured it out before I checked it online. So when Hammer is good, what it's good at is having a good mystery story and having a good monster. Oftentimes the difference between the Universal films is they're really more about monsters. This film in particular is more about the people who are having to deal with the monster, making it kind of a little bit more like what you'd think of a Godzilla movie, but more dealing with the aftermath of that. There's scenes where he's talking to the brother of the fiance, the guy he had to kill. They're dealing with what's going to happen and how horrible Dracula can be. They're not just looking at it as kind of like a fun thrill ride, although that's really in there, and I don't think these films would be as popular and remain as popular if they weren't fun horror movies, because I think it has that kind of mournful side to this film. It feels a lot more interesting. It doesn't just feel like a silly plot. But I also think the performances in these films are so astoundingly good. Any of the films with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, they make it work even if the film clearly doesn't. And not every one of the monsters they tried to do actually worked, but I think the reason this one is astoundingly good is it plays off of their strengths. Christopher Lee had a real physicality to him as an actor. Peter Cushing had that determination in his eyes, like you couldn't steer him away. You see that in Star Wars also. He thinks his way is the right way. And even if it isn't, you know he's going to get there. That works particularly well for Van Helsing, and the way he plays it is someone who's almost obsessed with Dracula. I've seen a lot of Hammer horror films, and some of them, not everyone was amazing. Some people act like they are sometimes, but they weren't. But this is always the one I liked the most. This is always the one that I felt was one of the greatest of the Hammer horror films. It was the one I most wanted to watch again. And when I think of Christopher Lee in Hammer horror films, I think of this film. When you think of how someone's popular or famous for a particular role and a particular reason, you almost need to see the reason they were famous. You don't have the context. And once I had the context, I fully understood. I knew Christopher Lee was a big deal. I'd seen Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and all sorts of things. But I think when you see Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee in a Hammer horror film together, and particularly this one, you will understand why they're such big deals and why I'm saying they're such good actors. I think it was filmed very well by Terrence Fisher, who was very much a Hammer horror director. He's almost more like a journeyman studio director. I'm not going to act like he had kind of the chops to be a real auteur the way Universal had their horror films or a great horror director would. I think he's a great horror director by default because of all he accomplished with Hammer. He was very much part of that house style. The direction wasn't really what popped out at me. I like the use of color in this film. I think it's very bright. It has a very 50s aesthetic appeal to it that really works. The color pops so well. I know it was in Technicolor, but it really made great use of Technicolor. It made me think about how beautiful Technicolor was. I've seen a few Dracula films, and not all of them I particularly liked, but if I was going to put a one second to Lugosi's film, it would absolutely be this one, because I think Horror of Dracula, or Dracula if you want to do that, works on its own. And that's something that a good remake or reboot should do, is because when I'm watching this film, even though it's Dracula again, even though it's literally the same book, it feels like something different. It feels very British. It feels like a mystery. It doesn't feel like the Lugosi film. It doesn't feel indebted to that film. And it doesn't feel indebted to any other version of Dracula like Nosferatu that came before it. It feels like it's something of its own. And I think that's something Hammer did very well, is everyone knew those Universal horror films very well at the point that they were making these, but they were smart enough to understand if they made it their own, then it would be viewed on its own. And I think that's one of the things when I was watching it later, I thought about how when I saw Christopher Lee there, I wasn't thinking about Lugosi, I was thinking about Christopher Lee. Except for when he held the cape around him, I thought of Lugosi then. I didn't think of it other than that. And I think that's what's so smart and why Hammer was unique. You might go like, well, I've seen Dracula, I've seen Frankenstein, I've seen these movies, why the fuck should I even bother? And the reason you should fucking bother is because it was a unique horror movie. It was a different kind of horror film. And you don't just try to recapture it. You do something new. And when Hammer did that and made it in a British way, made it in a different way, that's why, like, look at the American Office versus the English Office. They're very different. If you make something different, people will respect it more and it'll play more, and you play it more for different countries and a different culture's sensibilities. And that's kind of the same thing with what the Universal's Dracula did and Horror of Dracula did, is they played it to different sensibilities. And those different sensibilities helped make it a more unique and different kind of movie, and is why Horror of Dracula can stand on its own and stand right next to Bela Lugosi's Dracula, which is a great horror film, one of the greatest of the Universal horror films, and stand on its own and still look like a fantastic motion picture. And I think that says more, that it can stand up to probably one of cinema's great all-time horror movie figures and still be able to be a different kind of Dracula movie. And being second place in this case is not so fucking bad. It's a fantastic Dracula film, and I highly recommend it if you've never seen it. And if you've ever wanted to get into Christopher Lee, Hammer, or understand more about Peter Cushing, this is the movie. So if you have seen Horror of Dracula or Dracula and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. Thank you very much for watching, and have a happy Halloween.